You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
A plane colliding with the South Tower at 9:59 a.m. on September 11, 2001 would become the first terror attack watched in real time by millions of people around the world.
Good morning. We're bringing you this 3 News special after an almost unbelievable chain of events.
As we come on air, we have serious news of a major possible air crash in the United States.
The plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
We believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
News anchors struggled to maintain composure.
We do not very often make recommendations for people's behavior from this chair, but as Lisa was talking, I checked in with my children, and who are deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up, exchange observations.
New York, and more broadly the United States, was under attack. The North Tower continued to burn. Images and video footage was broadcast on every news channel. For a generation, these images would become imprinted on our psyches. We watched as the buildings collapsed, thousands of people still inside them. In a nearby hospital stood an Australian woman named Liz. For her, it was an otherwise normal day at work. That all changed when she heard an emergency siren. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is the second of a 2-part series re-examining the events that unfolded on September 11, 2001. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the previous episode, where I interviewed award-winning historian Garrett Graff, I suggest you scroll back and take a listen to hear a comprehensive overview of what actually happened that day. And now you're going to hear a first-hand account of what it was like working in a New York hospital when the planes hit the World Trade Centers. She has requested to be only identified by her first name, Liz. I wanted to begin with how that day started all those years ago. What do you remember about that morning on September 11, 2001?
Well, that morning, it was a Tuesday, which is just a nothing day in the week. Nothing was happening. There was no intel. We weren't at war. We had no idea of anything going on. And as everyone says, it was just this beautiful, cool, clear blue September day. And the New York summers are so brutal, so it was a lovely relief after the summer. And I was just working at the hospital. We have a little team meeting every morning where we get all our new patient referrals, and then we divvy them out to all of the clinicians, and we were just heading up to the wards. So there was nothing unusual at all. And that's when the external emergency alert sounded.
And what was that alert? Like, what did it sound like, and what did it actually indicate? What was it used for?
Well, in the hospitals, you have a code blue alert, and this was a new alert that we'd only had for a couple of months. We'd originally had one, interestingly, a few months earlier. I think it was like a code orange or something. I can't remember what the colour was, but it was indicating an emergency alert. And when we had this drill a few months earlier, none of us knew what to do. It was hilarious. We were all just wandering around going, what is this new alert? What do we do? And then typical New York style, all these people started turning up in wheelchairs and on trolleys covered in blood. And it took us a while to realise they were actors. So in hindsight, they must have had some idea that maybe an attack was imminent and they were preparing the hospitals. So they must have had some sort of intel. And so after that day, we all got proper training. We had a proper manual. We knew exactly what we were expected to do on the day. And so when that second alert came out again, we all thought it was probably just another drill because we'd done so badly in the first one. So we knew what to do. We knew where to go. We went straight to the staff cafeteria where we were supposed to rally. But something was different. Like, I was looking at our managers and they were sort of running around and they looked really concerned and really anxious. So I sneaked out of my office to call my partner, because back in those days you still had to use the office phone. And I rang him and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "A plane's gone into the World Trade Center North Tower, a big commuter plane." And we were like, how? How is it even possible? It was such a beautiful day. There was no clouds or anything. And we just figured it was a really bad accident, because planes fly over the city all the time. And we just thought one had gone off course and just accidentally smashed into the tower. And everyone thought that.
And what was your position in the hospital? So you were a nurse, is that right?
No, I was actually an occupational therapist, and I was a team leader of a pretty small team. I think it was about 7 or 8 of us, doing a job that I was not qualified for, but I was doing it anyway.
And what department did you work in that hospital?
So with the occupational therapy department, we were all over the hospital, but our offices and our main gym area was located on the ground floor, right next to the physiotherapy department. And that was on the ground floor right next to the ER. So that's why our area became important that day, because we became an overflow area from the ER when they had filled up.
And when people started to arrive, what did you see? What kind of condition were these people in?
Well, so we got the room all ready and we cleared out all our wheelchairs and shower stools and everything, set all the chairs up, and then people started coming in fairly quickly. I think by then we'd learnt that the second plane had gone into the South Tower, so we were really anxious at that point, but I felt really safe because I thought nobody's going to bomb the hospital in war. So I thought we're just going to see a lot of patients. And so people were coming into us. They were minor injuries. They were just covered in blood, or they had some cuts, and they were really exhausted and tired and covered in sweat. And I assume they must have come down from some of the top floors of the towers. And everyone was so quiet. Like, when people are in shock, they're not loud. They're really quiet. No one was talking. They're just sitting in these chairs staring at the floor. And we'd heard that there were some really serious burns in the emergency room and that people were dying there. And we'd heard that somebody had been nearly killed by a piece of the undercarriage of one of the planes that landed on her on the street. So it was pretty bad early on.
So when you say yours was an overflow area and you had people who had scratches or some who ended up having difficulty breathing from the debris and stuff, the people who went to emergency and were in a really critical condition, what were they suffering from? So burns was one thing. Do you know what else people were presenting with?
It was mainly burns. The really serious ones were the burns. And then when the buildings had fallen, again, we didn't realise the buildings had fallen, people just started turning up covered in this white grey dust. Then it was the breathing difficulties.
What was that white grey dust?
I think, it's had this really strange, concretey, earthy smell. It was probably pulverised glass and concrete mixed with probably a lot of asbestos, but it had a really acrid sort of electrical smell to it as well.
Was anyone at all talking about what had taken place? You said they were quiet and in shock. Were people in your sort of department wanting to ask questions and understand what on earth had just happened?
I think we did. I think we wanted to ask. We wanted to say what had happened because we didn't know. We had no phones. We had no TVs. So we were just going on what people were telling us, and all we'd heard was first plane, second plane, first tower fallen, second tower fallen. And in my mind, that was a couple of floors maybe falling over. But we just didn't want to ask people what was going on. I didn't think to ask people. I didn't think it was the right time or place because they were so traumatised. They were so afraid. I just didn't want to start asking them what was happening. And it was only later, it was only halfway through the day that I went upstairs and I was able to see the TV and see the images of the planes going in over and over again and seeing the towers falling, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Did you treat any police officers or firefighters?
Yeah, so later in the morning, more of the firefighters and the police started turning up, and they were sort of coming in groups. sort of supporting each other, and it was very emotional. These big guys in lots of equipment covered in the white grey dust. And I remember distinctly there was one firefighter that was brought in that the doctors and nurses were trying to work on him because he'd come in with a lot of breathing difficulties and chest pain from the dust. And he was refusing to stay. And basically a whole bunch of cops and firefighters sort of swarmed around him and helped him out and helped him to leave despite what the doctors were trying to get him to stay. And I just couldn't understand why he was doing that. And then later when we learnt how many first responders were missing or had died, it sort of made sense because he was going back to search for his friends and for his family.
That was the first day. Did it feel chaotic that day? Because as you say, it was an overflow area. So I imagine that initial emergency area would have just been, incredibly busy and full of people who were really scared.
It's interesting because it actually wasn't. I think because we'd had that drill first and we all knew exactly what we were supposed to do, I think we kind of just stayed where we were and we just kept treating one person after the other. It did feel very calm because people were so calm and people were so in shock, I guess. We all knew what we were doing, and I think that made a really big difference. And I think that does make a really big difference if you've got that training in place. So the first day, it didn't feel very chaotic because the whole city was shut down. Everything was shut down. The hospital was shut down. And by around sort of lunchtime, we didn't have any more patients arriving. It was really sad. The chaotic part was probably we were trying to get a lot of people out of our rehab wards, and a lot of people out of the general wards were being discharged and transferred to other hospitals across Manhattan to free up our hospital for beds that were in the end never filled, unfortunately.
Can you remember what the next few days were like?
The first day was pretty bad, but yeah, the second day, Mayor Giuliani was in charge and he was doing an amazing job. The rescue and recovery phase was really under control. Our hospital was under control. There was this amazing feeling of community and love from all over the world and from all over America. But that second day, because the hospital was so empty, I was sent to another building a couple of streets away. And basically, as I walked up to this building, there was a line of people lined up outside. And I was brought in, sat down at a table, and we had a pen and paper, good old-fashioned, old-school style, so we didn't have computers. And the people would come in and they'd sit down with me, and there was another lady on the table who was a nurse, and we had a list of the casualties. So all of the New York hospitals from all around Manhattan and outside of Manhattan were faxing each other lists of people that they had patients that were admitted that day. And so when the person would come in looking for their missing loved one, we would sit down, we'd go through the list with them, so much for patient confidentiality. In fact, I had one lady who recognised the name of her husband's colleague, and she left to go to that hospital because she wanted to find out what had happened to her husband, and she was going to ask him. But we had to sit them down, and if they weren't on that list, then we had to take the details of this missing person, and we had to write down their name and where they were working, how old they were, their hair colour, how long their hair was, and what they were wearing that day, and then ask them to bring back a sample of hair or the toothbrush for DNA. That was horrible to sit there and say that to these people. And they were husbands and wives and friends and brothers and sisters. And, they looked like hell. They looked like they hadn't slept. Some of them smelt really strongly of alcohol. And we would say things like, oh, there's still hope, there's voids, they're looking for people in the rubble. And it was just, I just hope I looked calm and kind because I didn't feel like that on the inside. It just still haunts me to this day. And I didn't find one person that day. I didn't find one person for those people that day. I just wrote down a lot of names.
What was the temperament of those people? Were they almost in a process of grief already, or were some of them angry? Were they impatient? How were they treating you?
They were very quiet, very shocked, very sad. I think they must have known, despite our reassurances. I remember one person was kicking off a little bit, but they had family around them to sort of calm them down and help them out. But it was just a process that they had to go to because, again, we didn't have computers. You had to go down to this hospital and fill out a missing persons report, essentially, if your person didn't come home that night.
Can you describe the sense that was in the air in New York on that day and in the days following? If you were walking down the street, was it generally really quiet and eerie?
It was very quiet. Like that night, the night of September 11th, I think they let us go. It was dark, so it must have been 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We were allowed to go home. The streets were deserted. There was no one on the streets. There was this haze throughout the whole city that smelt like that burnt electrical wire, and it was quite hard to see. There was no traffic because they'd actually closed all of the streets and they'd stopped all the trains and the buses running below 14th Street. And a couple of physios and myself lived in the East Village, so we sort of walked home together that night, but it was so deserted. And then the next day I had to walk to work again, and my boyfriend at the time, he walked me to work because his offices were down near the World Trade Center and they were covered in debris, and it took them 3 weeks to clean up the debris. I don't know how they cleaned up all the debris down there for him to go back to work, but they did. And so we walked to work, and again, the streets are deserted because everyone was home watching the television, I think. And I think they had Humvees on the streets, like the streets were all blocked off below 14th Street.
Is there anything else you can remember about those days and weeks afterwards in terms of the hospital and how you and other staff members were able to recover from that shock?
It was really lovely. The hospital that I worked in had really strong ties to the local community from the work that it had done during the AIDS pandemic in Greenwich Village. So that local community really rallied around the hospital. By the second day, there were tables set up outside, and there were celebrities even who lived in Greenwich Village that were cooking and providing meals. There was a line down the block to give blood, and people were donating clothes and blankets. And eventually the hospital had to tell everyone to stop doing it because we had enough blood, and we had clothes that were just piled up for weeks and months even afterwards in the corridors in big bags because we just didn't have any survivors essentially. And if that was happening outside our hospital, imagine what it was like down on the pile, down at the World Trade Center site. There was so much outpouring of support and love. I mean, one day word went out that the little search and rescue doggo paws were getting cut up on all the debris from all the sharp metal. So people started making leather shoes for the dog paws, and they had so many dog paw shoes that they didn't know what to do with them. It was amazing. So there was that really lovely feeling of love and support. And we all just got through it. We just kept working through it.
It's incredible how desperately people just want to do something. They almost want to be given a job.
Yes. It's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah. It's sort of been the same thing over COVID or bushfires. People want to feel helpful in the face of, a tragedy of unimaginable scale like that.
And everyone was so hurt. Like it was 12 million people in New York were affected. Like we were all traumatised. We all went through it. We were all affected. So we all had that shared experience. Even though we didn't personally lose anyone, we weren't grieving that, but we did all go through it together. So it was a really shared experience.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Liz, who was working in a New York hospital on September 11, 2001. At what point in the aftermath did it become clear to people that this was actually a planned terrorist attack?
September 11th, by lunchtime, I went outside to have a ciggy because you could smoke at that stage in a hospital. But by lunchtime, I heard the name Osama bin Laden. And I had never heard of him before. I never knew anything about Afghanistan and Iraq. I didn't know about any tensions that were between the USA and them. And people were saying his name by lunchtime that first day, and literally 4 weeks later, there was Operation Enduring Freedom. And 4 weeks later, they were in Afghanistan and invaded it, essentially. And a lot of people think, why did we do that? But on that day, because this came out of nowhere, I mean, there had been some escalating attacks around the world against US people, but that was the biggest terrorist attack on US soil. And I think it was the biggest terrorist attack, or the most fatal terrorist attack in the whole world that's ever happened. And so we were so angry. People were so angry. People were so shocked. that I understand why at the time we were so bloodthirsty. We wanted to go in and we wanted to kill people.
There's a lot that's been written since about anti-Islamic sentiment because of the way 9/11 was framed. Was that something that you recognised at the time? Was there anger or even racism that you recognised?
I was a bit of a little white country girl. I was probably a bit naive. I don't think I even knew what an Arab was. And I think there was a lot of talk about Muslims and Arabs, but I was kind of a bit naive to all of that and I didn't really understand it so much. I think afterwards there were a lot of attacks on Muslims in America. And we did hear about those in the news and it was always denigrated. It was always said that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't be taking it out on Muslim people. But I know that was going on in the background, which wasn't great.
Mm. And were there stories or even conspiracies that were circulating? Because, of course, there weren't only the 2 planes that went into the World Trade Centers. There was also the Pentagon and there was another plane that crashed into a field.
Mm-hmm.
What were people saying about those? Was there fear that this wasn't finished yet?
Yeah, that day we didn't know what was coming next. You were walking around going, is this going to be the next building that gets blown up? And then after that all settled down and, everything was shut down. The city was shut down. All of the flights were shut down. We felt a bit safer. There were jets flying over the city, so we did feel a lot safer. But then a few months after that, we had the anthrax attacks and we were opening our mail for months with gloves on. It was crazy at work and at home. And then a few months after that, there was the plane crash in Queens, the plane that was on the way to Jamaica that crashed and there were no survivors. So we had another external emergency alert for them, but there was no survivors. So there was just kind of one thing after the other, and everyone was really on edge still for quite a long time afterwards. You're right, we didn't know what was next.
Those patients as well who came in covered in the grey-white dust, did you know at the time that some of what they were inhaling or had inhaled that day was dangerous?
I think we all kind of knew that it wasn't good to be breathing all that in. I think by that night they were talking about the levels of asbestos and the chemicals in the air. And I know my boyfriend, who is my husband now at the time, we both don't know if we're going to have problems later on because of that. But there was a lot of stuff on the news, a lot of information coming through about how much asbestos we had all potentially inhaled.
There's been a lot of research come out since about the climbing death toll of 9/11, and there were the people who died that day, but whether it's police officers or firefighters or emergency services people or people who worked in hospitals really close to Ground Zero, that what they breathed in that day has caused cancer later on or breathing issues. That's something that I think a lot of people don't know, how lethal some of that actually was.
Yeah, and I think also the trauma of what people saw that day. But there was, like I said, 12 million people who experienced trauma. There wasn't any counselling back then. People didn't go routinely to counselling. And how do you counsel 12 million people who have just experienced a shared trauma? A few months afterwards, we got pulled into kind of a counselling session, but it was like 20 of us in the room, 20 of us clinicians in the room. And the guy who was leading it, I think he might have been a psychiatrist, not a psychologist or a counsellor. So he just stood up there and talked about his day and what he experienced and how awful it was. And that was it. That was our counselling session. We're like, great, thanks, mate. That was wonderful. And that was it.
Yeah, because everyone's trauma would be, although it was shared, it's also incredibly specific. There would be people that they spoke to or things that they saw that was very specific to them, I suppose. And that, yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, there were lots of people that went through a hell of a lot worse than what we did, that's for sure. And then there was also the flyers, the missing people flyers, which is such an iconic vision of the September 11th attacks. And by the second day, they were being put up everywhere and they were there for months, and you would just eventually walk past them and not even look at them because there were these lovely smiling happy faces and people holding babies, and that was just awful to see that, these poor people.
Were most of those people, as you say, who were still being searched for in the days afterwards, most of those people weren't found?
No. It was pretty much you either had minor injuries or you were killed. There wasn't much in between.
True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Gia Moylan. If you liked this episode, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast app. Or if you have a case you think we should cover next, you can contact us via email at truecrime@mamamia.com.au. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as Cancelled, a comedy podcast about the stories of celebrity cancellations.